people's ability to jump and land seems to be highly correlated with one's ability to not fall, or at least fall and control the fall in a way that leads to no or less severe injury.
Yeah, so Andy Galpin talked about this on your podcast. He talked about it on my podcast. What is the hallmark of aging on the muscle? It is atrophy of the type 2 muscle fiber. That's the hallmark.
Fast twitch
muscle fiber. So if you want to understand what looks different in 50-year-old Peter versus 18-year-old Peter, it's not my type 1 fibers. It's my type 2 fibers. It's my fast twitch fibers. It's my explosive fibers. I mean, when I was 18 years old, I could vertical jump over 30 inches. Today, I'm lucky if I can vertical jump 24 inches. And, and when I'm 60, boy, it's like my goal is to be able to vertical jump 20 inches when I'm 60, and I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do it.
I've seen some videos of some 80-year-old sprinters that are pretty impressive, and certainly 80-year-old gymnasts that are impressive. I've not seen very many videos of 80-year-olds dunking basketballs, for instance.
Yeah,
who are not taller than 6 feet
right,
5 inches.
So when we lose, so again, if you just think about size, strength, speed, we lose speed first. We lose speed, then strength, and the last thing you lose is size. So again, size is agnostic to fiber, right? You could have big type 1 fibers and still have lots of size. They're not going to be that strong, and they're certainly not going to be fast. So we could spend hours on this particular topic, but I think the most important thing that people need to understand is you cannot age well if you are not doing the type of training that is there to strengthen and delay or minimize the hypertrophy of your type 2 fibers. So everything matters, right? You have to be doing your zone 2. You have to be doing, all of these other things. But some component of your training needs to be stressing the type 2 fibers. You have to be doing strength training that taxes those fibers. You have to be doing reactivity training. You have to be doing explosive training.
And ideally, some training that involves jumping and landing.
Well, jumping is a very big part of it. And landing is a very big part of another one of what I kind of think of as my 4 pillars of strength training. So one of the pillars of strength training is eccentric strength, which is brakes. So, you're going to hurt yourself 10 times more likely. I'm making that number up, by the way. I don't know if it's 10 times, but experientially, it seems to be. You are 10 times more likely to hurt yourself stepping off something than stepping onto something, right? Stepping down versus stepping up. Because when you step up onto something, you are concentrically controlling a muscle. When you step down, you have to apply the brakes. And that's where most people falter. Much harder to walk downhill than uphill. Uphill is taxing your cardiovascular system. But if you slow down enough, you're fine. But a lot of people don't have the ability to slow themselves down when they're walking downhill. And so when an older person steps off a curb and can't fully stop themselves, and that results in a fall. So, I like doing things like a broad jump. Broad jump's a fun little test set I like to do every once in a while. I always want to make sure I can broad jump 6 feet. That's kind of my arbitrary number that I've chosen. And the reason is on the takeoff, that's a very explosive movement. But the landing is just as important. If I can't stick that landing, it means I don't have the brakes. So those are kind of some of the tests I want to be able to do to make sure that I'm utilizing that system. Because I do think, look, I've watched my mom. My mom fell, probably been about 4 months ago, just fell in a typical way that people fall. By the way, it could have happened to anybody. It's not like, my mom walks around and moves around just fine. But on this particular day, she just tripped on a uneven stone and fell and landed and broke her hand. And she's really lucky she didn't break her hip. And I told her that because my mom was, probably in her mid 70s. And I said, look, if that was your femur, I'd give you a 30% chance of dying in the next year. I mean, it's just those are such difficult to recover from injuries because first of all, you're dealing with the immobility of, the hospitalization and immobility that follows that. And the amount of muscle loss that occurs could easily be, 4 or 5 pounds of lean tissue lost that for most people that age becomes almost impossible to get back. And that says nothing about sort of the acute causes of death, like a fat embolism that results from a broken femur, a blood clot from laying in bed. Those things are also catastrophic. But what happens is a lot of these patients just never get back to the same level of mobility. And, now I think in many ways we're kind of pivoting from what kills you to what ruins your quality of life. And we've spent so much time talking about what kills you, but I think you might as well be dead in some ways if you can't do the things you want to do. And if playing with your grandkids or gardening or playing golf or going for a walk with your spouse, or think of any of the things that we all do today and take for granted, if you can't do those things, I don't know, you sort of lose the reason to be around.
And oftentimes the inability to do those things is associated with pain, which is psychologically and obviously physiologically so distressing. You mentioned the 4 pillars of health. Maybe just list those off for people.
Of lifting?
The 4 pillars of longevity through physical.
Sort of the exercise pieces of them.
Yes.
Yeah. So strength, stability, aerobic efficiency, and aerobic peak output.
Okay, so aerobic peak would be
VO2
max.
Yep. And zone 2. Mm-hmm. That's in my analogy. That's your zone 2 is how wide the base of your pyramid is, and your VO2 max is how tall the peak of the pyramid is. So the best pyramid has a wide base and a high peak. So you could have a reasonably wide base and a shallow peak. If you just did zone 2 training, you're going to get a reasonable peak, but it's not going to be that high. You have to do some of that specific training. If you just focus on high intensity, you might drive up that VO2 max, but you're actually going to have a relatively narrow aerobic base. So you think about just maximizing the area of that triangle, widest, tallest. Stability and strength. Stability, of course, encompasses everything we're talking about in terms of reactivity. I dedicate a chapter in the book to this concept because it is so foreign to most people, and for understandable reasons. It's not sexy. It's the hardest one to train. It's the hardest one to understand, but it's so important because it's the thing that I think differentiates people who age well and people who don't age well.
And I should perhaps throw in there, please correct me if I'm wrong, but also most of the machines that are in typical commercial gyms that allow people who are not very experienced to start doing some resistance training don't really tap into the stability factor terribly much. So while there's value to leg extensions and leg curls and chest presses and shoulder presses done with machines, certainly for a number of reasons, and can often be safer than free weights, especially for people who are approaching it at a later time or new to the whole thing, they don't really lend themselves to real life stability, walking down, as you mentioned, walking downstairs in the absence of a handrail, right, or movements in odd planes, having to step aside to avoid a bicycle, right, at an angle as opposed to just moving, linearly.
And by the way, a lot of things that don't involve machines still don't give you that, right? Doing a deadlift, you have to be stable to lift a heavy weight like you would a deadlift without hurting yourself. That requires an unbelievable capacity to harness intra-abdominal pressure and to be connected, especially if you're going to lift 500 pounds off the ground, you're stable. But that still doesn't prepare you for what you just described. So stability is multifaceted, and it involves doing a lot of things. Today, for example, today was a cardio zone 2 day. So I did my cardio zone 2, and I, had an extra 10 minutes before I needed to kind of get moving. And so all I did was step ups for 10 minutes. I just did single leg, very slow step up and insanely slow step downs off a box in a gym. So 2 second up, 4 second down, 2 second up, 4 second down with, and I would do them with ipsilateral loads, contralateral loads, all sorts of different things. And, basically that's just a stability game for me. It's like I'm building that concentric strength in a movement where it's easy to cheat, but can I do it without cheating?